Welcome to Nasdaq Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq. Joining us for this segment, we have Stacey Morris, Director of Research with Alerian. Stacey, it's great to have you with us. Welcome to Trade Talks.
Thanks so much, Jill. It's great to be here.
All right, and let's talk about the midstream and MLP space. Explain to us where the midstream fits in the energy sector.
Sure. So when we talk about midstream, we're really talking about energy infrastructure. These are the companies that operate pipelines, storage facilities, facilities that process natural gas, and they're really performing the shipping and handling function of the energy value chain. So importantly, unlike other sectors of energy, midstream is really providing services for a fee. And that has historically resulted in very stable cash flows for this space. As I mentioned, that's something that's very different from other sectors of energy that are much more sensitive to commodity prices.
What are the tailwinds that midstream saw in 2021, and do you expect the same for 2022?
Sure. So from a company perspective in 2021, a key theme was really free cash flow generation. These companies are generating significant free cash flow above and beyond their dividend payments. And that's really opened the door for buyback programs across the space. If you look at our Alerian MLP infrastructure index, about 70% of the index by weighting has a buyback program in place. And that index is the underlying index for the Alerian MLP ETF. So we've seen buybacks become widely adopted in this space as these companies generate significant free cash flow. And then from a macro perspective, we saw a strong recovery in oil and natural gas prices last year, multi-year highs in the second half of 2021. And a lot of that strength has continued into 2022. I mean, oil prices are up about 20% year to date. And so while these companies are providing services for a fee, we do see that what happens with commodity prices can impact sentiment in the space. So the continued strength in energy markets has been good for this space. Continued concerns about inflation have been good. And then from a company level perspective, the same tailwinds around free cash flow and buybacks are certainly continuing into 2022.
Why may midstream be resilient in a rising rate environment?
Yeah, Jill. So sometimes people worry about rising rates in terms of higher cost of debt and then also greater competition for income-oriented investments. When we've looked over the last couple of years when there have been periods of rising rates, midstream has generally outperformed other sectors like REITs and utilities. So we would expect the space to continue to be resilient, particularly because these companies have done a lot in terms of reducing debt over the last couple of years with excess free cash flow. And just overall are spending a lot less money. So we think the space is going to continue to be resilient in a rising rate period. And then in terms of competition from a yield perspective, the Alerian MLP infrastructure index is yielding just under 7% at the end of February. So rising interest rates, yields would have to move much higher for the competition to really become a concern. Midstream just provides so much more generous income already than most of your fixed income options. So we think the space is going to do well despite rising interest rates.
What are the benefits to real asset exposure during inflationary periods?
Sure. So real assets tend to do well in periods of high inflation. Midstream, of course, offers real asset exposure, but also specific to this sector, these companies often have contracts with inflation protection built into them. So there's typically an annual adjustment for their contracts where they're reflecting what's going on from an inflation standpoint and able to pass higher costs onto their customers. So we think the space is well positioned for today's environment. If you look at performance over the last 20 years or so, in years where inflation has been higher than 3%, the midstream space has generally outperformed the broader market. The one exception was 2008, but otherwise in 5 or 6 years where there's been high inflation, the space has done very well and outperformed. And so we think the space continues to be very well positioned for today's inflationary concerns.
And you brought up dividends before, so let's wrap up on that. What's your dividend outlook for midstream and MLP?
Sure. So especially relative to 2021 and 2020, we see dividend growth returning to the space in a more pronounced way. There have been companies that have consistently raised their dividends or distributions over the last several years, but we're starting to see some companies that maybe paused growth during the pandemic or names that cut in the past start to return to growth. And I think that's a good thing for this space, and it's contributing to more interest that we're seeing in the space. So just to give 2 quick examples, And MLP Energy Transfer announced a 15% increase to their distribution they had cut in the past, but made that announcement in late January. Plains All American announced their results yesterday and mentioned that they plan to recommend to their board a 20% distribution increase. So we're starting to see growth come back to this space more meaningfully, and I think that's been a positive.
All right, Stacey, we appreciate the insight. Thanks for joining us on Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.
Thanks so much.